Welcome to the first God and Country Radio YouTube. I'm your Bible teacher, Pastor B.E.Winship. For a number of years, I've been doing a radio program in the New York City Metro on Christian radio, providing biblical commentary on political, social, economic, prophetic events. And by the encouragement of some listeners, it's time to begin a YouTube channel. Now, my plan is not to repeat my weekly radio address in front of the camera, but to supplement it, to create YouTubes dealing with overarching issues, relevant scripture. And of course, my goal in addressing current events is to direct listeners toward Christ and His kingdom. I love 2 Chronicles 12:8. Where for a while God allowed Israel to be under the vassalage of Shishak, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And God says to the prophet in 2 Chronicles 12:8, but they, Israel, will become his slaves, Shishak's slaves, so they may learn the difference between my service and the service of the kingdoms of the countries. There is no better way to be driven toward God than to have to live under Satan's kingdom, in the kingdom of men. If you want to live independent of the Almighty, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-holy God, then this is what it's like to live under the dominion of Satan. Remember in Pilgrim's Progress, Christian leaves the city of destruction, and along the way he runs into the Lord of the city of destruction, Apollyon. And Apollyon says to Christian, how is it that you have run away from your king? And Christian says, I was indeed born in your dominion, but your service was hard, and your wages such as a man could not live on. For the wages of sin is death. Therefore, when I was come of years, I did as other considerate persons do, look out if perhaps I might mend myself. At God and Country, one reason I chronicle current events is to inspire people to leave the city of man and to go toward the celestial city, toward the kingdom of God. We who have come to Christ have a real country and a real king. Just like Abraham. Remember in Hebrews chapter 11? Abraham was looking for a city whose foundations and whose architect and builder is God. And we have such a city. And so we have turned from the dominion of Satan and we have turned to the kingdom of Christ. Now, what I would like to discuss in this first God and Country YouTube is a prophetic topic that I believe is very crucial for Christians to understand in these last days. There's great angst and misunderstanding as Christian morals are declining in our nation. And it's almost as if the Christianization of the pagan world that happened in the first 3 centuries of the church is being reversed. So that in the last few centuries of the church, the world is going back toward paganism again. Now, even though there is moral decline, let me also say that the church is doing quite well. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church. But as far as the earthly places of power, in government, in business, in education, Christianity and the Christian culture is being abandoned at an unprecedented rate. Now, to bring you into this subject, let me begin by asking a question. Why is America in a continual state of moral decline? A perpetual apostasy. The biblical prophets ask this same question, such as Isaiah chapter 1, verse 21. How has the faithful city become a harlot? The Hebrew word how in this text can be a complaint, it could be an amazement, or it can be an interrogative, a question. Or how about Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 5? Why then has this people, Jerusalem, turned away in continual apostasy? They hold fast to deceit, they refuse to return. Well, that's a great question, which reveals some important theological truths if it's answered correctly. Why has America become like Sodom? And the answer to this question is profound, and there are enormous ramifications concerning how you answer that question. You know, as you might suspect, there are many pundits and Christian leaders who blame the moral decline of America on the wrong thing, mistaking secondary causation for primary causation. But before I even begin to answer this question, the premise behind the question has to be defended. Because there will always be those who say that America is no worse today than in the past. I mean, after all, in the 19th century, there were saloons, financial corruption, prostitution, even cocaine use. People have always been immoral. There is one very popular conservative talk show host who makes a point in one of his books that it's a myth that America is in the midst of an irreversible moral decline. He writes this: worried moralists have railed against corruption, sinfulness, and the end of the American civilization since the very beginning of the American civilization. Well, the implication is this, that this concern over the moral decline in America is simply the old story of Chicken Little. The sky is falling, when really the sky is not falling. But in the case of America, Chicken Little might have a point. This is not alarmism. There has been a fundamental moral shift in America. In the 19th century, all colleges in America used to teach and promote Christianity. Secular humanism is now the standard. We all know that. The teaching of Christianity has been outlawed in public schools. There has been an increase in crime, immorality, pornography, divorce, broken homes. We have murdered over 60 million children through abortion over 50 years. Moral laws have been discarded. Our judicial system no longer believes in God's natural law. Law is now a function of human autonomy. And there are huge homosexual pride parades in every city. Nations actually do go into moral decline, as in the case of national Israel and the Old Testament record. Moral conduct in Germany in 1935 under Adolf Hitler was a lot different than moral conduct in Germany in 1535 under Martin Luther. So the scriptures teach in Psalm 9:17, the wicked will be turned to hell, even all nations who forget God. So nations actually can abandon God's moral imperatives. Paul wrote in the New Testament that evil men and seducers will grow worse and worse. And he also wrote that in the last days, perilous times will come. So I believe that a solid case could be made that America, even the entire Western world, is in a moral tailspin. But again, the question is why? And I need to diverge again to defend the question, because somebody might say, hey, this question is just too theoretical. I mean, who cares why? Let's just fix the problem. But asking why is very important, because how you answer the question determines how you're going to fix the problem. I mean, after all, a physician must first determine the cause of an illness before he can prescribe the cure. The wrong diagnosis means the wrong medicine. And knowing the cause of the moral decline in our nation really does affect how Christian leaders and teachers approach the problem. If you see the moral decline in America as being caused by Darwinism or a wrong cosmology, the primary solution you will look to will be the teaching of creationism. If you see the moral decline in America as being caused by a failure to follow Constitution, then you're going to embark on a campaign to teach people the Constitution. If you see the moral decline in America as the fault of the church, you might respond by railing against the Christian community, which is a response I see quite often. You know, as is often said, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So the reasons put forth for America's decline is very often related to one's field of interest or study. Now, I am not saying that some of these secondary causations don't need to be addressed. I mean, after all, even a doctor describes medicine to relieve symptoms. But at least let's acknowledge the difference between the symptoms and the disease itself. So, to get you to think about this question, let me list a few reasons that are put forth for the moral decline in America, even very dogmatically put forth. And I hope by this exercise, this will help lead you to some truth. In fact, you might see in this list some of the reasons that you believe America is in a state of decline. Number one, first, a very simplistic answer would be America is in moral decline because people are sinners. Well, that's true. But people were sinners in 1735, and at that time, America experienced the Great Awakening. People were sinners in the Roman Empire, and yet the early Christians conquered the Roman culture. So something else must be going on here. How about number two? It's a conspiracy. I constantly get emails, books, letters that attribute the moral decline in America to a secretive group of communist operatives who implemented a multi-point plan to infiltrate education and politics. And even in regard to the sexual revolution, that it was actually a well-orchestrated plot by LGBT political operatives. So, that theory is implying that the secularists won here in America because they worked a better plan than the Christians. But there are always ungodly people with plans. The question still remains is why the ungodly and their agenda was so readily accepted by the American public. Why didn't the gospel message of the church grab the attention of the public? And which came first? The chicken or the egg? Did secular humanist operatives bring about moral decline, or did moral decline bring about secular humanist operatives? How about number three? America's moral decline is due to evil being uniquely empowered in the 21st century. Now, there are a number of categories under this heading. First, Evil was empowered by the generation of wealth. We became spoiled by our prosperity, and therefore we no longer needed God. A famous Puritan, Cotton Mather, wrote this: Christianity begot prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother. But do we really want to teach that spirituality is a function of poverty and need, so that poor people become spiritual and rich people become unspiritual? And therefore, the only way to have a revival is to become poor. And that means people only come to God for what they can get from God, which was Satan's philosophy laid out in Job chapter 1. And if people come to God only when they have a material need, is that really true faith in God? Another empowerment that could be said to bring about evil is technology. Evil has spread in our generation because of the television, because of the internet. Never before in the history of the world has such evil been able to enter into people's homes. And so therefore the television and the internet are responsible for the increase in corruption. But aren't these things just tools? Tools that can be used either for good or for evil? The question still remains, why did Americans choose to use these tools for evil? Empowerment doesn't produce intrinsic evil. How about this? Empowerment by automation. No longer do Americans have to work by the sweat of their brow. The curse of Genesis, Genesis chapter 3. Americans live a life of leisure like no other people in history. And that is not good for the soul. Labor is necessary for people's spiritual well-being. Psalm 107:12. He humbled their hearts with labor. Or evil could have been empowered by big government. And the contention here is that government's the culprit. There are lots of conservative pundits who take this position. And the idea here is that if Christianity was on a level playing field, it could have competed and won against secular humanism, but the secularists cheated because they expelled Christianity from the courts, and they expelled it from the public schools, and by taxation, they funded the religion of secularism in higher education. So if liberals didn't have federal funding to pursue their agenda, they could not have won in the marketplace of ideas. And much of this blame is put on public education, and rightly so. Lenin said, give me 4 years to teach your children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted. So as the schools go, so goes the nation. And no doubt, the domination of public schools by secularists has had a great impact. C.S. Lewis wrote a piece called On the Transmission of Christianity. And I want to read this because it relates very closely to the question we have here. In this piece he wrote that if a nation discovers that young men are poor at mathematics, we should consider that this has been adequately explained the moment we discover that for some years schools have ceased to teach mathematics. And we should turn a deaf ear to people who offer explanations of a vaguer and larger kind. People who say that the influence of Einstein sapped the ancestral beliefs in fixed numerical relationships, or that gangster films had undermined the desire to get the right answers, or that the evolution of consciousness was now entering on its post-arithmetic phase. At this point, Lewis is making fun of the intellectuals. But then he goes on to say, so in the same way, if the younger generation has never been told what Christianity says, and have never heard any argument in defense of it, then their agnosticism or their indifference is fully explained. No Christianity is being taught in public schools, so obviously that is why there is the decline in Christianity and Christian values in our country. That is really a great explanation for our moral decline. But it's still secondary. Because we have to ask the question, why was Christianity cast out of public education in the first place? And why did the public stand for it? Again, it's the old chicken and the egg problem. Did ungodly education produce apostasy, or did apostasy produce ungodly education? So, moving on, let me give a few more reasons here. A fourth reason. A failure to follow the Constitution, or a failure to include God in the Constitution. Number 5, the breakdown of the family. Once the family structure was disrupted by divorce, this resulted in not only the failure to pass down values from the older generation, but it caused the younger generation to despise the values of their parents. So the fault is laid at the breakdown of the family. Number 6, many blame the church. Either a failure to evangelize and disciple, or a failure for the church to be involved in the political process. And what would be the cause of that? Maybe bad theology was involved. And so you will hear some Christians say, it's the fault of Arminianism, or it's the fault of Calvinism, or it's the fault of the Pentecostal movement, which in its foolishness discredited the gospel message. Or some will say that it's the eschatology of dispensationalism. And I've read plenty of articles by opponents of dispensationalism that claim dispensational theology emphasized escapism, non-involvement in building a Christian nation, and therefore America's decline is due to Christians abandoning politics, and the culprit is dispensational theology. Now I don't believe that's true, and there's all sorts of holes in that theory, but the theory is being circulated. Now, others might say, well, it's not a theological problem, it's just bad Christians. And that comes by taking 2 Chronicles 7:14 and working backwards. You know the text, 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, will forgive their sins, and will heal their land. So therefore, if the land is not healed, the fault has to be because God's people did not humble themselves and pray. And so America's decline is the fault of the church, because the conversion of the world and the morality of the nation is considered a function of the obedience of God's people. Now, it's amazing how many Christian teachers imply that theory. But when you press them on it, they immediately back off because they know it's theologically untenable. I mean, Jesus was the perfect minister to Israel, yet he didn't win Israel to righteousness, and the nation had to be judged. 2 Chronicles 7:14 is not a promise that if a minority of faithful Christians do their job, they can convert a nation. I actually plan to be doing a radio program, doing an exposition of 2 Chronicles 7:14 in the next couple weeks. Actually, it's already recorded. I just need to find a spot in the queue to put it in. There's another very similar area I want to cover here, and that is what I call the super Christian early church belief. And it goes like this. The early Christians were such super Christians, men of great evangelism and prayer, that they were able to convert the entire Roman Empire. And hence, if we become like the early Christians, we can return America back to Christian values. Well, have you ever studied church history? The Christians in the early church were just as much, if not more, of a mess than Christians in the 21st century. And the early Christians did not convert the Roman Empire by their great testimony or by their apologetics. Something else was going on. Given mankind's fallen condition, Ephesians chapter 2, that the unsaved are dead in their trespasses and sins, and that they are by nature children of wrath, and given the fact that Christians are always in the minority, Matthew 7:13, Jesus told us we would be in the minority. Enter in at the narrow gate, for narrow is the way that leads to life. Well, given those truths about the depravity of man, maybe we're asking the wrong question. Rather than asking, why has there been such moral decline in the 21st century? We should be asking, how could it be that at any time in the past, any nation or any people adopted Christian values and culture? It doesn't make sense. And the answer has to be the sovereignty of God constraining the wicked as he wishes to further his plan for his people. Remember in Acts chapter 12, King Herod is lifted up in pride, and immediately the angel of the Lord strikes him and he dies. Remember Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. He's lifted up in pride, and immediately God removes his hand from Nebuchadnezzar, and he loses his mind for 7 years. He eats grass like an animal. Now, couldn't God have continued to do this throughout the entire church age? With any civic leader who steps over the bounds? Well, of course. Psalm 75:6. For not from the east, nor from the west, nor from the desert comes exaltation, but God is judge. He puts down one and he exalts another. Daniel 4:35. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. But he does according to his will in the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? So God could have providentially always exalted the righteous and kept the wicked from ever getting into the place of authority. Because God is in control of the world's spiritual thermostat. God has been restraining the wicked and causing unsaved people to conform to Christianity and the Christian culture. And unless God had continued to restrain, the world would have been plunged into gross immorality overnight. See, the unsaved think that their goodness is their own. I was just reading a piece by Jonathan Edwards, 1740s, and even though he was a post-millennialist, and he believed that the Antichrist was defeated in the fall of the papacy, And he actually believed that the church was experiencing her latter-day glories, that the church was entering into the millennium. He actually believed, from Revelation chapter 20, that the ungodly world would make one last attack on the church, surrounding the camp of the saints, Gog and Magog. And although I don't agree with Jonathan Edwards in the way he supported his final apostasy, his conclusions were still correct. Now, the key text that mentions the great apostasy at the end of this age is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And this text is particularly important for the church because here the Apostle Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, explains to the church what signs to look for before the coming of Christ, the end of the age. And we are to look for the great apostasy. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. Now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed, either by a spirit or a message or a letter as from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. Well, given the persecution in the first century and the Jewish revolt in Israel, the Thessalonican Christians thought that they were in the apocalypse. Notice they actually believed that there would be a day of the Lord. But Paul teaches in this text that they are not seeing the apocalypse, because two things must take place before the apocalypse comes. Two signs. One, the apostasy must come first. Second, the Antichrist, or the man of lawlessness, must be revealed. The Antichrist revealed is not the apostasy. These are two separate events. They're interrelated, but they are distinct. One is a social movement, the apostasy. The other is a person, the Antichrist. Now, the text says the apostasy must come first, which suggests a chronological order. A very common but unfounded prophetic assumption is that the apostasy and the Antichrist appear on day one of the 7-year tribulation. But given what we know about the rise of lesser antichrists, like Antiochus or Nero or Hitler, it's more reasonable to assume that the Antichrist will be a world figure long before we see the unfolding of the apocalyptic events. And the apostasy itself also precedes and ushers in the Antichrist and the day of the Lord. The order of the events is very significant, because there first must be a worldwide ideological cultural change before the world will give its authority to this demonic demagogue. This social change can be actually a process that takes place over decades. Now, what's the apostasy? The word apostasy has taken on a religious connotation. The King James Version translates it the falling away. But the Greek word here is the word apostasia. And it's just been transliterated into the English apostasy. Now, unfortunately, because this word has taken upon itself a religious connotation, many Christian leaders have limited the apostasy to false teachers in the church. that the end day church will go into apostasy. And certainly that will be true. The visible church will become apostate. But the Greek word, as it was originally used, had nothing to do with a religious context. It meant a revolt, a military rebellion in a political sense. And so what this is really describing is the entire world in final rejection of God, as we see described in the book of the Revelation. And that can be aptly described as a rebellion or as an apostasy. Now you might say, wait a minute, the world has always been in rebellion to God. Well, that's true. But the world, even in its rebellion, has submitted to much of God's natural law, especially throughout the church age. But what may be being described here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is a fuller rebellion, a complete rebellion. Now, how does this apostasy come about? Does mankind become intrinsically more wicked all of a sudden? Does the church fail to do its job? Is that why the apostasy comes about? No, because Paul explains that it is God himself who allows the apostasy to take place by removing his restraint on the world. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 6. And you know what restrains him now, him being the man of lawlessness, so that in his time he will be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way. So now we know that the Antichrist is coming, and the Christian community talks often of the Antichrist. But there is too much silence concerning this worldwide movement called the apostasy. And again, the mistake that believers will often make is that God is removing his restraint on day one of the 7-year tribulation. When really it's more likely that God removes his restraint previous to the apocalypse, so that there is a generation on earth that has abandoned God and is willing to embrace the Antichrist. It's more likely that the world will slip into the apostasy over a generation as God removes his restraint. In fact, do you see any place in this text that says that God will remove his restraint on day one of the tribulation? No, it's not there. God removes his restraint in preparation for the revealing of the Antichrist. So what I'm suggesting is that what we might be experiencing in our world today is God lifting his restraint on the wicked. Unbelievers are now being allowed to act like unbelievers. They're no longer constrained to give lip service to Christianity. Now, why does God do this at the end of the age? Well, God doesn't leave us in the dark on that. 2 Thessalonians 2:12, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth but took pleasure in wickedness. Now we know that God could judge the world simply for the intentions that he knows is in people's hearts. And God could judge the world for its potential evil. But God instead removes his restraint so that the world shows its evil, the evil that has been restrained by God, so that it would be seen that God is just in judging the world. The world's goodness is not its own. It's due to God's restraint. And natural man would have committed all the atrocities of the apocalypse from day one if it were not for the restraint of God. So we read in Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, this is the time of testing that will come upon the whole world. And God is allowing this so that the true nature of the lost comes to the surface, is showcased. And God is allowing this to purify the bride, the church, to build and to test our faith. Now, I am not claiming that we right now are at the cusp of the apocalypse. That what we're seeing is the fulfillment of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Because there have been times in the past where God has removed his restraint in certain countries and regions and for certain times. Such as during the French Revolution, Nazi Germany in the 1930s, Russia in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. And so we've also seen many forerunners of the Antichrist. So right now, I don't think we can be sure that we're experiencing the final removal of God's restraint. But my objective here is for you to simply consider the doctrinal truths found in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. That we might actually be in a special administration of God. What does that mean for us today? It doesn't mean we should run to the mountains and build safe houses. It doesn't mean we should change our evangelism or our discipleship. It doesn't mean we should give up on the world. But it does free us from false guilt, from silly explanations for the decline of morals in America. And it does explain why there are such crazy, bizarre, foolish policies coming out of the woodwork in the Western world. But finally, an understanding of the prophesied apostasy should encourage us in our soon victory. Because the increase in wickedness is a sign of its soon defeat. Let me read one psalm here. Psalm 92:6. A senseless man has no knowledge, nor does a stupid man understand this, that when the wicked sprouted up like grass and all who did iniquity flourished, it was only that they might be destroyed forevermore. You see, the people of this world do not understand that the proliferation of evil means the soon judgment of evil. As Jesus said before his crucifixion, this hour and the power of darkness is yours. But it was only very temporary, because on the cross, Satan was defeated. God's people will be on the right side of history. So 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, let no one in any way deceive you, for the day of the Lord will not come until the apostasy comes first. May God bless you, and may you abound in knowledge and in all discernment. Thank you for making God and Country a part of your discipleship.